Illumination in the Black Box, on the history of opacity. The story of radical thought, or thought concerned with origins, which emerged as philosophy, recognises only two basic ways to start thinking. We shall call them the black beginning and the white beginning. As regards the white beginning, we shall assume as much as possible, tending towards everything, and with the black beginning we shall assume as little as possible, right down to the zero limit. People who prefer white are staking on the openness of the world, and are carried along by the certitude that, as long as we keep our eyes open, the relevant universe is always revealed to us in its self-sufficient totality. This is like understanding the world in the Olympian mode. For obvious reasons, this arose at a relatively late moment in the history of the intellect, because it presupposed that human beings could conceive a God who neither works nor intervenes. This is the famous philosopher's God, who, under the code name Observer, is enjoying a comeback today among the scientifically interested public. His relationship to the world can best be described as illumination in the white box. To understand this, you should try to imagine Zeus, the father of the gods, the founder of joviality, up on the summit of the gods, going out onto the veranda after a siesta, with his eyes wide open, sharply watchful, almost wickedly casual, his gaze sweeping over the archipelago of things. With such an attitude, getting an overview means overlooking a great deal. Moreover, it means being content with everything as it is. In this case, the world is a white box, and we are standing inside it, as in a sphere of light. The intellect looks around in it freely, as it does in something completely open and unquestionably illuminated. Because everything is finished and done, the only thing thought can do is to look around and celebrate. Nothing in the box could suggest the creation of technologies and problems. Gods are too happy to construct, and too detached to be affected by urgent matters. The Olympian god is the one who sees no reason to distinguish what is visible by the light of day. The philosopher Ernst Mach, in the introductory remarks, anti-metaphysical, of his major work, The Analysis of Sensations and the Relation of the Physical to the Psychical, described an early experience that resembled such an Olympic panorama. Quote, "I have always felt it as a stroke of special good fortune that early in life, at about the age of 15, I lighted, in the library of my father, on a copy of Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. The book made at the time a powerful and ineffaceable impression upon me, the like of which I never afterward experienced in any of my philosophical reading. Some 2 or 3 years later, the superfluous role played by the thing in itself abruptly dawned upon me. On a bright summer day under the open heaven, the world with my ego suddenly appeared to me as one coherent mass of sensations, only more strongly coherent in the ego. Although the actual working out of this thought did not occur until a later period, yet this moment was decisive for my whole view." End quote. Mach is describing the typical white box position as it appears in various types of mysticism and phenomenology. It is probably based on the doctrine of Parmenides of Elea, whose dogma that being and perceiving are the same thing gave the idea of the white beginning of thought bathed in light, the status of a European norm. This resulted in thought experiencing a dead-end satisfaction through its share in the felt universe, which is only another way of saying that it led to nothing. The only results were second-rate, with nothing supreme. People who could amalgamate with the white box were people for whom thinking took a permanent leave of absence. They would enjoy the happiness of the god of idiots, and that of the middle in the people, the phenomenologists, if phenomenology was seen as the art of explicitly describing everything pre-existing in the conscious mind, without intervening operatively in anything. In contrast to this, as in Eastern schools of meditation, for instance, but also in Western philosophy in the works of Descartes and Ernst Bloch, is the black beginning. Here the intellect descends into an artificial darkness, induced by ignoring all the world's certitudes, and by radically doubting so-called sensory data. The subject has his or her eyes closed, and broods in the darkness of the lived moment, exploring a fictitious state in which wisdom or operations do not yet exist. The only pressure and undefined presentiment, Kafka described it as like a life of hesitation before birth. Ernst Bloch, in his famous books of introduction, such as the Introduction to the Philosophy of Tübingen, gave a classic formulation of this beginning of thought in the black box of anticipation, presentiment. Quote, I am, but I do not have myself, so first of all we become. The am is inside. Everything inside is dark by nature. To see itself, and even what is around, it has to go out of itself. End quote. The result is a philosophy of exodus from original darkness. It interprets the world not as something that has always been inherently open, but as something that was predicted and in need of construction. It is the prophetic position of constructivism. The variations of this circulating today mainly operate through a filter of system theory. Alongside this, out of the darkness, a tradition of Cartesian thought has developed, in which the subject achieves full procedural control over his or her ideas by radically reconstructing his or her beliefs on the basis of logical criteria. The Cartesian cogito undoubtedly furnished the prototype for the subjective black boxes of the modern age. It offered an attractive procedure for smashing white boxes and totally reconstructing the world out of the thinking black cells. Some people see this as the start of the subjective mechanical engineering that launched modern times as the age of the engineer. The cogito, the thinking self, was a patent for reliably positioning the ego at the foundation of all other ideas. Descartes' argument was like software for subjects who wanted to confirm their ability to build hardware machines without being machines themselves. In fact, post-Cartesian generations were engaging in new horizons of the art of engineering. Think of state engineering in the theory and practice of absolutism, the engineering of beauty in the Royal Opera House and in the palace ceremonies of absolute monarchy, truth engineering in the early academies of science, educational engineering in Jesuit high schools and in their Protestant and secular counterparts, personal identification engineering in police forces of the modern age, and military engineering in the standing armies of territorial states. These examples show how the ability to build out of the worldless thinking black box has powerful effects in the world. In modernity, the sovereign person is the one who decides on the installation of black boxes. Taking the two beginnings of thought together gives us a glimpse into the depth structures of European rationality. Starting with the Greek Enlightenment, ambitious thought was concerned with putting the world of the big white box into the small black box of knowledge and competence. If, instead of doing that, we did the opposite, which seems more obvious, and put the black box into the white one, it would have to be invisible inside it, and to vanish in the contented light of the celebrating intellect. If the intellect were operating instead of looking around jovially, the black box would necessarily grow to a substantial size. The reason why the two boxes have to be fitted into each other in this improbable way is thus related to the power that resides in knowledge. Although thinking in the white box may be comprehensive and exhilarating, it allows only a weak form of sovereignty because it is inoperative and impotent. On the other hand, thinking in the black box may be narrow-minded to the point of stupidity and may tend to feed subterranean feelings of life, but it has a logical aggressiveness and momentous impact. Bacon's modernist motto, "Knowledge is power," should be interpreted as if he had said that constructing in the black box is power. The process of knowledge has had a formatting problem since its beginning. The ancients spoke of it when they described the human characteristic of wanting to know everything as trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. Theologians affirmed that the finite intellect could not follow the calculations of the infinite. Consequently, mere human beings were compelled to distinguish themselves from God and admit that only He, the absolute superior one, experienced the full unity of black and white. Only He combined universal production and universal contemplation into absolute enjoyment. In our case, however, it was advisable to be modest and abandon the process of theoretical ambition as soon as possible, and accept that human beings were destined to climb into the little grey box of faith, and from there to reach the big white box in God one day. This was the constant pattern of theological critiques of human endeavour under ancient Western premises. Today it appears mainly in the pious arguments of the Green Party. Despite such warnings, the attempt to draw the whole world into self-constructing black boxes has remained attractive, even for people of the modern age. While it may have seemed absurdly overdone to begin with, it would never totally lose its exuberance, despite a long stagnant period from late antiquity to the beginning of medieval university history, and the time when a renewed drive to accumulate cognitive capital began on European soil. This vouches for the long-term explosive effect of the arts generated by the initial black experiments. For a long period, black intelligence challenged the white majority with the proof that all power came from the black box. It is not the sunny eyes of patronage shining on the world that change the world. It is the strictly formulated and operatively closed worldless ideas of competence that come out of the darkness and create the effective interventions in pre-existing reality. This already indicates the formation of the constructivist image of the world. But we may assume that by Plato's time, if not before, people understood the full epistemological seriousness of this situation. His work shows how thinkers refined their understanding of the power of what comes out of the black box. Plato had good reason to assign such great importance to mathematical exercises. He recognised that numbers and geometric figures were sovereign factors that arose out of the black box and did not need the visible world to be true. Of course, Plato understood that human beings naturally stand in the middle. He accepted that we remain attracted to the flesh, although we participate in the revelation of numbers. Platonism left a legacy of an image of human beings in the twilight between eroticism and mathematics. We are beings that must still love, although we can already calculate. No wonder that after Plato there were continually philosophers who wanted to attribute more than a half share to calculation, to God's ideas before the creation, and more generally to connections made independently of context. The spectre of absolute knowledge has haunted European history of knowledge ever since. It implies the idea of entirely replacing the white box with a black box that would have its own light. This contains the program of the constructivist revolution. The black box of operative consciousness should foster development of a construction manual for the whole world, including operative consciousness. This would mean that the theory for the great totality that began as white would stop being merely jovial, just for Sundays and only contemplative, and would develop in the black box of consciousness competence into applied workaday art. In other words, into technology. Great theory would then truly and finally become what it always wanted in the depths of its magical dream. A technological world power. I am aware that I have introduced an idea of the black box that contradicts the usual black box concept, made famous by the behavioural psychologist B.F. Skinner. As we know, Skinner wanted to remove the so-called mentalist concepts of introspective psychology, such as an active will, spontaneity, freedom, interiority, intelligence, and so on, from the field of purely empirical psychology based on tangible behaviour, and demanded that the object, or the behavioural complex traditionally, called the soul to be seen as a black box. He argued that wanting a direct glimpse inside the black box was impossible and pointless. Skinner claimed that he borrowed the term black box from soldiers' slang, and that it was used to describe objects left behind by the enemy that should not be opened and investigated under any circumstances, because they could be explosive. By contrast, I have suggested a concept of the black box that preserves specific features of subjectivity and idiosyncratic interiority. Not, of course, as a sort of mystical spark, but rather like an endogenous agenda, or a fixed idea that repeats itself without a context, and holds steady against changing environments. Typical examples are intelligent machines like flight recorders, which are now also called black boxes. In some cases, after plane crashes, the black box is searched for as if it were the only surviving soul on board, in a position to give information about the reasons for the crash. This assumes that a black box is both seen as an environmental scanner, something like an observer and memory of flight parameters, and as a context-free unit. And while people in crashes fall out of their biological continuum from a great height, black boxes are not sensitive to sudden changes in altitude. They are designed to record landing and crashing with equanimity. We may assume that in the present technological revolution, increasing numbers of people will develop the wish to become immortal black boxes. The white box religions are gradually fading away because they presuppose the idea of human beings as overly vulnerable, overly passive, ontologically masochistic creatures, whereas the white box seems to privilege perception over action. This is the normal phenomenological situation. In the black box, a person's own operation is unconditionally privileged in relation to the environment. This, in turn, is the standard situation of technology or any kind of systematic operation. The two types of boxes are constantly intermingled in the everyday experience of the world. If the world is perceived as the white box, it is expected to be open and transparent. Ideally, the white world is a space without secrets. At most it has shadows, but nothing unknown, no reverse side completely in darkness. People feel they know the situation and are secure in brightness, and things that are not directly in the field of vision are still visible in principle, even if there is no observer looking at them at the moment. The white world offers a possibility of all-embracing epistemological serenity, because being and presence converge in it. But everyday experience always sabotages this openness to some extent, for even in the world seen in terms of white preconceptions, we are struck by emerging black boxes, standing out from the bright background like disturbing blotches. Their existence, but even more, their prominence, the way they protrude and stand out, clouds our white box feeling. And when we look around the developed globe, we realize that at critical places, important things exist, and we cannot look inside them. As a whole, the cognitive daily life of Homo sapiens is like an intermeshing and juxtaposition of open and closed objects. And at the point where this result itself is recognized as an open and self-evident fact, the phenomenological axiom that the familiar takes priority over the unfamiliar tips the scales. Ultimately, the world is everything in which we feel familiar. What is unfamiliar only wins out in pathological periods, and this can lead to black boxes overshadowing the world in general and seeming to be impenetrable toto genere. Historians of ideas have identified periods that were largely influenced by such feelings about the world. We are thinking particularly of late antiquity, when people saw the imperial machine as an alien structure, and the present-day world in which large populations have the feeling of living in a transit camp of innovations. There are reasons why late antiquity and the modern age are the two great epochs dominated by Gnostic theories of exile, periods in which people succeeded in making propositions about their displacement in the world. The omnipresence of black boxes is, however, a matter less of feelings about life than of cognitive strategies. For the black box forces its observers and partners to switch from understanding to external manipulating. In places where the world is crowded with black boxes, the phenomenological optimism which insists that things are inexplicable by their appearance is corroded. The moment we catch sight of the black box, understanding hits a barrier. In fact, When we encounter black boxes every way we turn, our usual comprehension totally collapses. The dark curtains disturb us by making us feel that things in their interior are very different from their surface appearance. Inside them, the essence of appearance turns its back on us. This experience of the exterior of the black box insulting our intellect has its own specific history. It is the intellectual history of being unable to understand, a history that splits into two strands. The history of the intelligence resigning in the face of things it cannot fathom, and the invasive history of research that mounts a cognitive counterattack as a response to being humiliated by the limits of understanding. In what follows, I shall try to establish the thesis that the process of the modern age shows by its results that it can no longer be interpreted as enlightenment, as the growth of transparency. Rather, it creates situations in which, more than in any other form of early culture, the environment surrounds us and is an aggregate of black boxes produced outside of it. I would like to describe this process broadly as the cultural history of the opaque. It illustrates the process of intelligence in relation to non-transparent factors on the basis of 5 typical configurations that I shall call the grave, the body, the book, the bureaucracy, the complex machine. It would be an accidental but not undesirable effect if people recognise this series as a progressive approach to the living environment, or rather the box environment of modernity. 1. There is no doubt that the people of the modern age still see the grave as a suggestive, if outmoded, representative of the black box principle. Modern coffins epitomise the things we do not look inside of. First, because the idea of leaving the dead to rest in peace demands great respect, and second, because we are convinced that, with the exception of a few criminological or politically motivated exhumations, buried coffins have nothing to tell us. The modern box for the dead is a demystified, and therefore empty, black curtain. We no longer assume it to be an operative subject, something whose activities could reach out of the darkness and intervene in our sphere. This conviction of the emptiness of the box for the dead obviously developed in a lengthy and difficult cultural process. It belongs to the solid core of something that enlightenment still means in a positive sense today. Enlightenment implies the conviction of sepulchral nothingness, the certitude that nothing is planned and put into operation in coffins that could have consequences for us in the light of day. In this respect, the coffins and graves today are the only black boxes with which we have a totally relaxed relationship. They are epistemologically extinguished objects. In their case, we no longer have to worry about hidden centres of action. The dead are out of the competition for reality. A brief review of the history of belief in the dead will convince us this was not always the case, and that in earlier times graves were regarded as the real operational centres of world events. If the dead are not simply, as people think of them in the atheist modern age, not discarded biological machines past their expiry date when the immune systems stop functioning properly, for that is what the systemic concept of life actually means. If dead people have not ended up being switched off absolutely, but have moved on to a different aggregate state of being and now exist invisibly on the other side of the light, then it is obvious why graves were once the epitome of filled black boxes. If they contained important personalities, particularly ancestors, kings, and founding fathers of religions, the peace of the box was not guaranteed. On the contrary, the grave is a prime crucible of unrest, a workshop for activities that affect us, an office in which functionaries from the netherworld compose and decide measures for the present world. From this perspective, in ancient times, the grave was nearly the paradigm case for black box experiences. The real powers were at work on the other side of the grave, and used it as an entrance into our world. Consequently, in relation to the realm of the dead, the concerns of human beings between the Neolithic Revolution, the beginning of the great period of ancestral burial, and the modern era, the age of pacification of graves, have fairly clear outlines. The living had to do everything conceivable to obtain the most precise ideas of the interior of the imminent black box. In pre-philosophical terms, what we have known as metaphysics since Aristotle's time began as nothing other than black box research, the attempt to get a glimpse inside the black boxes of ancestors, kings and gods. The axiom of the oldest theory of cognition is knowledge of the grave is power. Penetration into the black box of the dead allows complicity in the procedures of the other side. This means that everywhere around the centre of ancient cultures we find priestly knowledge that is primarily knowledge of communication in relation to the spirits inside the black box. Ancient Egyptian culture probably went furthest in this respect. It not only had a complex sociology of gods, but its books of the dead also show that its priests drew the best maps of the afterlife, so that death in Egyptian society could be conceived as a carefully planned journey into well-charted territory. Skinner, incidentally, would have had to labour with a double form of mentalism in the Egypt of the pharaohs, because the Egyptians thought humans possessed not just one soul, but two. One was born in the body, while the other lay in the placenta. This is why the pharaoh's placenta was always mummified immediately at birth, and safeguarded in the office of a royal priest until the ruler's death, after which the external and internal soul embarked together on the journey into the realm of the dead. Fortunately for Skinner, he lived in Christian America, where there was only one soul to deny, not two. Given these oldest studies and imaginings, we can speak of technology originating from the spirit of observation of tombs. Anybody who wanted to be powerful in this world had to try to discover what the operators in the interior of the black boxes planned, and how they set about achieving this. This is how magic, the mother of technology, arose through imitating and thwarting the operations of the dead. Anybody who came from the light to penetrate the secrets of the black cell acquired symbolic and thus operative power. The human capacity to act was largely restricted to having control over symbols. 99% of operations that were essential for life were symbolic acts. In mythical terms, they were mainly based on imitating the deeds of the dead. By contrast, the non-symbolic operations of technology mostly came from imitations of the living black boxes we called bodies. The path to the modern age is identical with the development from symbolic to technological actions. 2. Aside from graves, living bodies were in fact the decisive black boxes in ancient times. This applies both to animal bodies and to human bodies. At first we never know which is which. Even if one lives inside such a body oneself, it is impenetrable and has no porthole for looking into. All the same, as the inhabitant of myself, I have privileged access to my body, which may be an advantage during coitus, but is certainly a drawback in the case of snake bites. When it comes to other people's bodies, they are truly opaque entities that we are prevented from opening. We don't even consider looking inside unless they are enemies, whom it is permissible to cut open in some circumstances. As an aside, let me say that the innocuous-seeming notice stamped on mail, may be opened by the post office, has a sensitive anthropological background that becomes obvious when we realise that we are the post office and the parcel is the enemy. In terms of animal bodies, the idea that hidden operations occur inside them stems from two experiences that we can't ignore. First, the fact that animals and human beings die, which implies, secondly, that the vital operators have stopped working inside them and have moved on to work elsewhere. In this respect, acquiring knowledge means something like having a glimpse of the modus operandi of the vitalizing force in the interior of the box. Research that was inspired in the age of philosophy by the promising term self-knowledge. Knowing oneself meant surprising the internal vitalizing force, combining with it, and ensuring that we stay united with the operating principle even in death. From then on, we are superior to our own black box, the body, and can consider whether we settle into another box after moving out of our own, or whether we enter a pool filled with disembodied souls that religions describe as paradise, or condominiums filled with God's presence. The modern world, however, did not explore the interior of the black body box on the path of so-called knowledge, but with anatomical methods. The biological sciences show us how human beings proceed with a black box of nature in the modern way. One begins with surgical explanation and biochemical presentation, and does not rest until individual parts or functions can be replaced in the interior of the box. Indeed, the essence of technology is best described by an anatomical prosthetic process, which operates on two levels. First, release, which means the extraversion by which an interior becomes an exterior. And secondly, substitution, the development of the prosthesis. A broad definition of prosthesis allows us to develop a rigorous description of the conquest of the black box. Let us assume that my body will not provide a headache-free state at the moment. If it is nothing more serious, I can be free of headaches with the aspirin prosthesis. In other words, the technological axiom of bodily enlightenment is that we only understand what we can substitute. As a result, what was initially the black box becomes the glass box for us. The technical body, as we know, is the transparent body. But technology is looking for more than the release of the interior of corpses. The bodies themselves force us to make the complementary observation that small, screaming boxes fall out of some of them, that we identify on closer inspection an offspring. At first we do not understand at all how they can be produced inside there. Our mothers fascinate and terrify us so much because they embody the black box for their own ends. They are extremely cunning black boxes that look harmless in family photos. There is much to be said for the assumption that thinking begins in the child as dreaming of the difference between the inside and the outside of the mother box. Anyway, the principle of the mother's womb, to an even greater extent than the grave, is a focal point for interior work that cannot be observed. It is, incidentally, not by chance that ancient maternal religions everywhere assume the identity of the grave and the womb. In doing so, they use the opportunity to explain one unknown factor using the other. This was the operation that helped people in earlier times not to surrender completely to cognitive defeatism. The operating forces in the mother box show us that nature only provides us with results whose production we simply have no possibility of actively participating in for the foreseeable future. But technological intelligence does not accept being permanently excluded from female production. It opens the mother box and asks the question, how, inside it? Whoever supports transparency will publicize the mother plan. Whoever wants to take the risk of more democracy will make the mother's body into a public place. In terms of the history of ideas, the pioneers in the mother box are the early metallurgists who shrouded their techniques in secrecy and developed them in an exact analogy for the perinatal process. They extracted the ores from the maternal mountain and processed them in artificial mothers, in stoves and foundries, like an accelerated pregnancy, until gold and iron were produced. The historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, wrote a beautiful book about this, The Forge and the Crucible, whose subtitle could be On the Birth of Technology Out of the Spirit of Masculine Substitute Pregnancy. This theme persisted in the continuum of the history of ideas up to modern times, even if gynecologists replaced metallurgists and alchemists in the turn to modernity. There is much to indicate that in future the symbol of masculinity will no longer be the phallus, but the test tube. Anybody who opens the black box of life to understand what goes on inside it is also relying on the prosthesis. Research in this field means drawing construction plans for nature and realizing them as substitute plans in one's own work. Genetics researchers act like industrial spies, peeking at the procedures of a rival company, nature, and faxing them from the mother's body to the genetics laboratory. We could call this the Lopez effect in natural philosophy. At the moment, it seems that the industrial concept of the future will make an impact here. Three, if we look at the book as a black box, we are dealing with the first pure cultural construct with an opaque appearance. Books, like graves, may have significant interior, but their grave character and body character are entirely culturally produced. It follows that the book is the original model of the perfect technogenic black box. It is the original perfect machine, the first efficient working hypothesis of the magic of high culture. The history of high culture up to the present day has always been first and foremost the history of the book, and to the extent that the process of this history has progressed, it also represents, perhaps, a history of optimization of the book. It was the emergence of the book that had first enabled the relation between white and black boxes mentioned earlier. For the book is the prototype of the black box in which the white box is supposed to be enclosed as a spatial paradox. It is the little box that makes major content transportable, which would not be possible without writing as a technique of miniaturization. Writing means first and foremost writing big things in small letters. This is why the literate faction of humanity has been hoping for the ultimate miracle of enlightenment since the emergence of the book. All readings are only preliminary readings while we are waiting for the final book. In terms of its structure, the metaphysical age was a waiting period for the book that contains everything. Until that point, we also read novels, mathematical textbooks, weekend supplements, essays on system theory and other ephemera. The metaphysics of the book hits its first crisis with the new media, basically with the rise of the newspaper in the period from the end of the 18th to the beginning of the 19th century. And today, if we are not completely deceived, we are seeing the irreversible transition to post-metaphysical book culture. This involves a new black box phenomenon replacing the book as the primary magic box made by human beings. Since the arrival of the new media, waiting for the book that will turn all previous books into footnotes has become meaningless. The wonderful feeling that everything is in the box has shifted to another medium. Since its first appearance, the book has had a divisive effect on its host societies and has provoked a nearly anthropological distinction between groups that have the power of literacy and those that do not. Early on in ancient Egypt, the scribes were a mysterious caste, while ordinary people who could not read saw the temple texts and scrolls as machines of the gods. We can see traces of this divide in Shakespeare's works, and Prospero's studies in his magic book that mean more to him than his dukedom testify to an epoch in which the inside of a book could become more important than the state, or, more precisely, the heart of the state itself was a secret text written in books that were difficult to read. The book thus introduced the experience of the man-made black box into partially literate society. The vast majority of people in the age of handwriting knew books only as book spines or unrolled cylinders. For most people, opening them and trying to read them was an almost sacrilegious idea, which incidentally still applies more than we may imagine today. Countless people still think of books as something too meaningful for them personally to be allowed to intrude into. The man-made black box makes most people depressed, and only manic ambition leads people inside it. In the Middle Ages, if somebody said, "I want to learn to read," it was practically the same as saying, "I want to be a priest." What we call humanism was essentially the project of grammatical education of the human species. And what we understand as human rights is essentially the same thing as the dignity that we are owed as subjects capable of reading. If we assign human rights to ourselves, it is because our names are in some book or other, at least in church records and at registry offices, because we are beings about whom something could be written in books, whether individually or as groups. If God, the greatest of all readers, knows us, It is because our name, if we are lucky in metaphysical terms, is entered into the book of life. Our fellow human beings have to recognise us because we carry a small book, our passport or identity card with us. People who are not satisfied with this minimal book, or who are unsure whether God will find their name in the book of life, can write books themselves to secure their name and lay claim to the human right to be read. This assumes that we have reached the interior of the world of books and have mastered the art, among other things, of dealing with writing materials. This assumption does not hold for the great majority of human beings even today, and for them the equivalence of the book and the black box is still valid. Most people will pass the whole of their life without getting beyond the level called the user interface on technical devices that, in the case of books, means the covers and what is printed on them. Societies have been deeply divided for thousands of years into those that could operate in books and those that see books as opaque bodies. This is also expressed in two different types of destruction of books. People who burn books because they oppose their content belong on the pages of the book themselves, because that type of destruction is a kind of review. Book burners are only innocent when they throw books into the fire in the firm belief that their most important quality is that they can be burned. The most famous recent case of a naive book burning occurred in 1946 after the discovery of the Gnostic library of Nag Hammadi. The grandmother of the person who found the manuscripts burned what was probably the major part of the find in a fire for brewing tea. There is something of that grandmother in all of us, because literacy is inherently a fragmentary project. We can only absorb a fraction of all existing book pages, and we too behave towards all the rest of the books as if they were destined for making tea. Nonetheless, alphabetization has artificially illuminated our interior world in a wonderful way. Our dark brains light up when they climb into the right black boxes, and reality quickly starts wavering when its inhabitants open different books. At around the same time as the book, a huge black box emerged out of the human sphere that was described by those who knew it well as a cold monster. I mean, the state, embodied in administrative authorities or bureaucracies. In the worlds of the ancient Egyptians, the Greeks and the Romans, learning to write was mostly used directly to obtain entry into the political black box. For farmers and artisans, however, the early empires, with their palaces and temples and chancelleries, seemed like entities from outer space, sitting in their oversized graves, replete with a mysterious inner life driven by fate. Even today, some people have supernatural feelings at the sight of administration towers, seeing them as vertical coffins in which deals are done for us. But the actions of the state in the interiors of government offices basically consist of correspondence. This is why the state needs special tables, the so-called bureau, that were used for writing files ex officio. The French word for writing desk, bureau, is thought to come from the coarse cloth, laboure, with which the officials' writing desks had to be covered, just as the Lord's table in churches, the altar was supposed to be covered, to distinguish it from profane tables. Bureaucracy consists of acts of writing at the covered table of state. We know that Charlemagne, when middle-aged and already ruler of a military empire, tried to learn reading and writing because he rightly believed that a monarch with great ambitions like his had to be the foremost reader and writer in the state. This was the only way a Germanic black box could make itself strong against the Byzantine one, and it was only by this means that Franconians became new Romans. The throne was once the symbolic heart of the political box, and public offices functioned as its internal organs. If we only study the history of the state and political ideas as they are conventionally presented, we will miss a decisive aspect of statehood. We will fail to see that for this public of all epochs, a face of the state existed that seemed to be completely lacking in ideas and incomprehensible. Those who work in the monstrous box themselves justify the state in terms of its rationality, initially for sound theological reasons, later for sound democratic reasons that are not called reasons of state for nothing. Anyone who sees the political black box from the outside, however, and that still means the great majority of people today, just notes that people simply do not understand the state, whatever reasons might be given for their attitude. This is why most of the history of political ideas could devolve into a history that has regrettably never been attempted. The history of the state not being understood by its inhabitants. This lack of understanding emerged in two aggregate states. The dramatic state, particularly in war and revolution, is opaque for its inhabitants because they never understand the motivations of the actors in power, or do so only too late. For example, when the gentlemen publish their memoirs. Most Europeans are vaguely aware that Napoleon went on a military campaign in Egypt, but we may well doubt whether anyone, in present times as well as historians, has ever understood what he wanted to do there with his army. The trivial state, on the other hand, is opaque because its subjects, later its citizens, do not usually know what public servants and administrators do in their hidden routines. As long as the state has existed, popular incomprehension about any kind of activity by public servants has also existed. Indeed, insight into the machinery of state almost resembles an epistemological matter. The question, what do public servants actually do, is nearly as fundamental as Immanuel Kant's question about how synthetic judgments are a priori possible. Anyone asking the question had to be willing to investigate the interior of monstrous boxes. But what could seriously make us want to do that? Systemic experts would explain that the opaque administrative state is only expressing a normal structural division. Bureaucracies are constructs that create high levels of complexity for themselves under what we are told is a meaningful organisational imperative. It follows that their opacity could be a sign of their efficiency. In other words, let's give Bonn and Brussels the benefit of the doubt. Just as most people live extremely well without knowing the details of the processes in their lungs, duodenum or prostate gland, they should leave the state to its own devices as long as things function to some extent, without having to know exactly how foreign ministries, federal financial administrations or defence ministries are constructed. Luhmann showed brilliantly how trust must substitute for understanding in complex systems. In fact, the states that have become famous in history have taken considerable advantage of our lack of understanding of what they do. Conversely, they have mostly taken a tolerant attitude towards our lack of interest in them. When opinion polls show that 2/3 of citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany do not know the difference between the Bundestag, the German parliament, and the Bundesrat, the federal council representing the different federal German states, experts regard this as a sign that the Federal Republic is in good shape as a system. It would be much more threatening if masses of students started taking an interest in pension systems, or if the whole nation took the foreign minister's concerns to heart. There are times, however, in which populations who understood more would be indispensable for sustaining troubled nations. Most of all, the population would have to understand more and more why they understand less and less about the actions and non-actions of the state. Europeans are facing a century ahead that will be brimming over with extra lessons in the political black box. What we once naively described as the long march through the institutions will turn out to be the duty to do overtime in the insides of a complicated monster. Five. This brings us to the last object in our series of black boxes. Technical equipment in its most recent form as it occurs everywhere in practical daily life. Today we are surrounded by countless parasubjective systems or automats that would make psychologists of the Skinner School feel extremely uncomfortable. These systems actually function in a way that can be convincingly described without reference to mentalist concepts. Automats are the first subjects that are reliably trivial machines. In other words, units for which the instructions for assembly and use also make their essential character essentially understandable to us. The symmetry of production and understanding remains a privilege of the producer because technical equipment in the user's market, especially in the case of a mass-produced article, is inherently only for use and does not want to be understood. The majority of high-technology black boxes today are ironical, or, in psychological terms, contemptuous machines. They appeal to users who are happy with being just users, and who generally avoid getting into intellectual competition with the machine. For these undemanding users, the manufacturers, assisted by designers, have made the machine charming. We live in an age of sympathetic devices. Charm in the design age means superficial politics and thus expresses the recognition that unavoidable insults must be rephrased in the form of compliments. Every complex device basically signals to its user that he or she is declassified beside it. But a clever user interface does not say that, because it is not deep. It does not have to be upright and honest. It turns to the owners with a smile that assures them that they can feel in control. If you correctly interpret that mechanical smile, you will find a less complimentary message behind it. In fact, the smart system is telling its users that it is enough when only one of the two of us is an idiot. This reverses the black box principle in an epistemologically significant way. For the first time in the history of the opaque, users learn an attitude that leaves them free not to want to get to the other side at all. This is because high-tech black boxes, although overfilled with complex functional elements, are metaphysically and psychologically empty. It follows that we can be sure that the devices do not personally want to insult or manipulate us. It would be inappropriate to try to compete with them, and it would be excessive to try to fathom their construction details. The modern high-tech box encourages its users to stay at its surface level, and we should note that this is a good-tempered rejection. From the perspective of economy of thought or life, devices actually have no depths that would reward getting inside them. In fact, we are better advised to replace defective devices rather than try to understand them. This attitude launches a quiet cultural revolution. Interactions with devices they don't understand have a direct personal effect on people and lead to elegantly shallow relationships. Young people in many places are already growing up in a world of erotic norms that are about scoring in a reciprocal game of user interfaces. It is evident that release from understanding leads to relief. But not only interpersonal relationships are affected by the departure from understanding. It affects the whole ecology of the mind. There is much evidence to suggest that in terms of practical knowledge, modern high-tech boxes lead to an unprecedented situation in the history of ideas. There are signs of the return of an old Stone Age attitude in which the searching and incisive approach, the pressure towards the other side of the black box, is disappearing altogether. The great desire for knowledge that fed on sepulchral darkness, feminine secrets, the enchantment of books and the mystique of the state becomes trivial in the face of a mechanical environment that we don't understand in the least, but that increasingly relieves us of the burden of being expected to understand. Be smart, be an idiot. This is the motto of the new black box ethic. Ask about the buttons and keys and leave the interior complexity alone. There are people who are paid not to be idiots in relation to the insides of machines. Fight back only when the paid non-idiots are exposed as idiots after all. It follows that modern societies mediated by machines are collective entities of inter-idiotic relationships that involve precisely defined fields of non-idiocy, or consultancy services. The popular expression for these architectures of inter-idiotic relationships is quote-unquote network. These structures attempt to interlink weak intelligences in such a way that they are smarter together. In networks, intelligences become teams, insofar as we precisely define teams as performance-boosting groups. Societies, on the other hand, are constructed so that the intelligences of the players make each other mutually trivial or predictable. It is easy to check whether one is in a team or in society. Anyone who is smarter together with others than alone is in a team. Anybody who is smarter alone than with others is in a society. This perspective allows us to explain the misery of the intelligence economy in democracies, and certainly in despotic societies, because such social ensembles almost never acquire team qualities. The media of democracies also function according to the latent guiding principle: together we are more stupid. It is easy to understand why a total non-idiot no longer makes sense in these games, and it follows that classical philosophy, which has been declared dead for more than a century, has actually reached the end in the face of the newest black box. The philosopher was the delegate of societies that tried to cope with their inability to understand by postulating some people who understood everything in the heart of the world. Today the world has been offered to everybody for not understanding. The complex machines have taught us how not to understand. Some people know how the machines are made, while the rest learn to be satisfied with knowing how to push a few buttons. This experience is important for our understanding of what intelligence is and does. Perhaps the only relationship we have to the world as a whole is a relationship of touching. The whole thing is not a white box, as phenomenology and its theology suggested, but is, all in all, a black box with a few small active lights inside. Active lights are not suns, and the old metaphysics of light and enlightenment is no longer responsible for them. Wherever the horizon is black, its opacity stops being irritating. We reach the end of the seemingly immemorial phenomenological illusion of trust and familiarity. The epoch of belief that once existed in the disclosedness or presence of the entity as it emerges in the world is coming to an end. This makes it clear that intelligent watchfulness may occur, but it is a property in short supply and only has a weak light. Not everything is as it seems, and we ourselves do not have an internal light for everything. We begin to realize that the deeper connection in between being and not noticing, between reality and not understanding, between power and non-appearance. Manifestation is the ontological exception, and the things that are comprehensible and familiar are merely a thin film over the things that are incomprehensible and unfamiliar. Complex machines subtly help us over the basic phenomenological illusion. Philosophy's tendency to overload the obvious comes to an end under the smile of the user interface. Intelligence is released on a large scale in the process, disappointed but happy. It is only after this disappointment that we understand the difference between working and celebrating, in a way no other generation has understood it. The light of this difference brings the illumination into the black boxes.